convinced of a God, but the heavens remained silent. By Gurubesar, Lancar Bagus. God is a persistent human thought, an invisible presence that arose from fear of death, existential loneliness, and the longing for meaning within a finite existence. Throughout history, people have sought answers to a silent universe, often filled in by religious voices that claim to speak on behalf of the divine. That construct has become deeply embedded in history. What began as the search for meaning quickly became authority. What began as comfort became control. The moment an imagined will is attributed to something that cannot speak. Space is created for anyone who claims to know that will. And precisely there, power begins. Yet the heavens remain silent. No intervention in genocide, no correction in war, no rescue at the moment innocence is lost. What remains is a long human history in which it is not God who acts, but humans who act in God's name. And that distinction is essential. The Bible and other sacred texts fit entirely within that pattern. They are not timeless revelations, but human documents, shaped, rewritten, and adapted within shifting structures of power. They bear the signature of their time, not of a supernatural source, but of priests, kings, and societies that sought to order and control their reality. For that reason, these texts have remained so useful. They legitimize what people already wish to believe or do. Power, guilt, obedience, and exclusion are given a sacred veneer. Whoever controls interpretation ultimately controls the thinking of others as well. That is not a spiritual truth, but a sociological mechanism. Religious traditions, including sacred books, belong within human history as culturally formed documents. Over time, they have been reinterpreted, rewritten, and deployed within various power structures. In doing so, they have served both as sources of meaning and community, and as instruments of legitimation, genocide, and social influence. And this is precisely where it becomes sharp. The moment belief is used to forbid doubt, punish dissent, or claim moral superiority, it turns into an instrument of control. Not because faith must be that, but because it contains that possibility within itself. At the same time, nature remains utterly indifferent. No intention, no plan, no moral judgment. Life arises from processes that do not see, do not choose, and do not promise. And precisely that makes human beings responsible in a way that religious systems often try to soften. There is no higher authority that ultimately corrects it. That realization is uncomfortable but also clarifying. If there is no heavenly judge, the justification of "we are right because it is divine" falls away. Then only human action remains, with all its consequences. Sacred texts, in this light, are not revelation but history, a mirror of human fear, ambition, morality, and power. Their meaning does not lie in absolute truth, but in the insight they provide into how societies think, obey, and justify their reality. For that very reason, it becomes problematic when these texts function as the endpoint of discussion. The moment criticism disappears behind the idea of divine truth, conversation stops and obedience begins, not to truth, but to interpretation presented as truth. The real confrontation does not lie in religion as a belief system, but in what lurks beneath it. The human need for certainty so strong that it is transformed into absolute truth and subsequently managed by those who are permitted to interpret that truth. What is labeled sacred by religious masses rarely arises in a vacuum. It is shaped, directed, and sustained by religious and political leaders who, throughout history, have understood how effective it is to deploy the divine as authority for human governance. Within this lies the mechanism of power, The moment an idea is presented as of God, the possibility of dissent disappears without being perceived as resistance against God himself. It is precisely this principle that has made religious structures historically so useful for control. Not because every believer consciously employs it in that way, but because leadership within religious systems has repeatedly demonstrated how faith can be transformed into obedience, obedience into influence, and influence into power. In this dynamic, sacred texts cease to function as neutral sources of meaning. They become instruments that are selectively read, interpreted, and applied. Through both spiritual and secular leaders, from historical institutions to contemporary religious authorities, meaning is not only explained but also delimited. What is permitted to be thought, spoken, and embodied is partially determined by their interpretation of the sacred. Thus, a pattern emerges that remains visible to this day. Religion as a language of meager consolation, submission, violence, and also as a structure of control. Where power is concentrated in the interpretation of the sacred, doubt becomes suspect, criticism dangerous, and deviation morally problematic. Not because the sacred demands it, but because those who hold power require such a system in order to preserve their position. How much of what is presented as sacred truly serves as a source of meaning, and how much serves as legitimation for authority that protects itself against contradiction? For once divine will coincides with human interests, the distinction between guidance and power disappears. And it is precisely there that it becomes visible how even today ideas of the sacred are employed to exert influence over thought, behavior, and obedience. Thank you for listening.